Have you ever wondered what happens when the world casts you out only for you to find your true home in the one place you were meant to be a prisoner? They whispered that her size was a disgrace to her family name. They sneered that no man of standing would ever want her, and that was precisely why her own father used her as a pawn, a punishment disguised as a reward for a bonded man. But the one thing no one knew was that this man would come to see in her a value her own bloodline had refused to acknowledge. And the secret she would uncover in his humble cottage would unravel a truth so devastating it had the power to shatter two powerful families forever. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you are joining me from today, and if you also believe that the most profound love can blossom from the deepest soil of rejection. The grand halls of Blackwood Manor were gilded cages, cold and unforgiving. The light from 1,000 beeswax candles danced off polished marble floors, a spectacle of wealth that seemed to mock anyone who didn't belong. In the heart of the immense drawing room, silks and satins swirled in a kaleidoscope of color, a symphony of forced laughter and calculated glances. The sharp click of heeled shoes was a constant, rhythmic punctuation on the cold stone. It was a night of performance, of appearances, of beautifully constructed lies. And there, in the midst of all the faces painted with manufactured grace, was Lady Eleanor Ashworth, daughter of the Lord, granddaughter of the General, heiress to a legacy of blue blood and a body that defied every slender convention of her time. Eleanor never went unnoticed, but never for the reasons a young woman might wish. Her gowns were always custom-made, flowing and wide, embroidered with timid florals, as if their purpose was to conceal rather than to celebrate. Her hair, a thick, dark cascade, was tamed into modest braids, and her face, which held a quiet, classical beauty, was consistently overlooked because her silhouette dared to occupy more space than the cruel eyes of society would permit. On this particular evening, Eleanor made her way down a secluded corridor flanked by towering tapestries. She could feel the stares. She knew that every muffled titter might be directed at her, but she held her chin high, a practiced mask of indifference. What she didn't anticipate was the sheer, unvarnished cruelty that was about to find her. A knot of young noblemen were conversing near a marble fountain, and among them was Lord Harrington, the very man her father had been unsubtly promoting as a potential suitor. "I hear your family is considering a match with the Lady Eleanor," one of them baited him. Harrington let out a derisive snort loud enough for the whole corridor to hear. "I'd only marry her if her dowry included the entire estate, or if I needed a human shield in a battle. With a frame like that, I'd save a fortune on armor." The explosion of laughter was the blow that struck the deepest. Eleanor was only a few paces away. She froze, pretending she hadn't heard, but the sting of tears was immediate and hot behind her eyes. Her heart felt like a small bird, its wings broken by a carelessly thrown stone. The world around her continued its dizzying spin, but inside her time had stopped. And in that hollow silence she glanced across the room and saw her father, Lord Ashworth, watching the entire exchange. He did nothing. He didn't approach, he didn't defend her, he simply turned his head, a subtle, dismissive gesture as if nothing had happened at all. Eleanor did not dance that night. She waited only long enough to retreat to her chambers, to unlace the suffocating gown, to let her hair fall free, and to stare into the oval mirror that had been her silent companion since childhood. She traced the lines of her own face. She examined the features. The world seemed so determined to reject the softness in her eyes, the gentle curve of her jaw, the shape of her hands. She did not hate what she saw, but the world seemed intent on teaching her how. The following morning she was summoned to the great hall of the estate. Her father was seated rigid and imposing in his high-backed chair flanked by his advisers. His expression was a sheet of ice devoid of warmth, devoid of remorse. "Eleanor," he began, his voice dry as dust, "there are decisions that must be made for the good of the family name. You have not brought honor to it, but perhaps you can still be of use." She felt a chill crawl up her spine. What did he mean by that? He explained that the crown owed a debt of gratitude to a man for his service in the border skirmishes. A bonded man. A commoner. He had saved the life of a viscount. The king wished to grant him a companion, a wife. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "And what has this to do with me?" Her father finally met her gaze. "You will be that Grant." The floor seemed to fall away beneath her. "This is a punishment," she whispered, her voice barely audible, fighting to remain upright. "It is your purpose," he replied with the chilling finality of a man who had never truly seen his own daughter. That afternoon Eleanor did not cry or scream or beg. She simply went to her room, took the simple crimson ribbon her mother had once worn in her hair before she passed, and wove it into her own braid. She knew her life was being traded like currency, but she chose to leave with her head held high. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruise purple and grey, Eleanor was escorted to the very edge of her family's lands. A small cottage of stone and wood awaited her, and standing before it was Caleb. Tall, powerfully built, with skin weathered by the sun, and eyes that were deep and held no fear. She stepped down from the carriage without a word. She expected a sneer or contempt, but he simply gave a slight nod of his head and said, "Welcome." And in that simple, unexpected gesture, Eleanor felt the first tremor of a story the world was not yet ready to hear. The carriage departed before the dust it had kicked up had even settled. There were no farewells, no final words of comfort, not even a parting glance of pity. Eleanor stood frozen, her fine shoes sinking slightly into the dry, packed earth of the lane. Her simple linen traveling dress, once a symbol of her demotion, now billowed in a soft breeze that carried the scent of old wood smoke and damp earth. The sky overhead was a heavy, brooding grey, laden with clouds that seemed to hold all the tears she refused to shed. Before her stood the cottage. It was small and solitary, built of rough-hewn stone with a dark slate roof. Its windows were narrow, its wooden door scarred by seasons of sun and rain. A modest clothesline holding a few stark white cloths fluttered against one wall. On the other side, a neat row of herbs hung upside down to dry, releasing a surprisingly delicate, earthy fragrance. She hadn't known what to expect, but it wasn't this. The home was humble, yes, but there was an order to it, a sense of deliberate care. It was as if every stone had been placed with purpose, as if the small space itself was declaring, "There is no luxury here, but there is dignity." Just then Caleb emerged. He came from around the side of the house, a small basket of kindling cradled in one arm. He wore a worn cotton shirt, breeches tied at the waist with a simple rope, and his feet were bare against the cool ground. His skin was dark and weathered like the bark of an ancient tree. His gaze was deep and unnervingly calm. When he saw her standing there, he paused. His eyes moved over her, not with the judgment she was so used to, but with a quite cautious curiosity, like a man gauging the wind before taking a step. And then he spoke. The house is yours if you wish to enter. Just that. No sarcasm. No disdain. Eleanor hesitated. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath caught in her chest like a trapped bird. But she moved forward. Each step was a defiance, each movement a reminder that she was not there by choice. As she crossed the threshold, she was met with the smell of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, something toasting, perhaps corn or roots. The cottage was divided into two small rooms. The main room held a simple wooden table with two stools, a bench covered with a striped wool blanket, and shelves bearing plain earthenware pots. A rolled-up rug was tucked in one corner. In the other room there was a small bed with dark blankets and a single closed wooden chest. "You can sleep in there," he said, gesturing to the smaller room. She could only manage a nod. Her voice was still lost somewhere inside her. Caleb went back to the hearth. He coaxed the fire to life with steady, silent movements. He put a kettle on to boil, steeping a tea from dark green leaves. The gentle hiss of the water was the only sound between them. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally she managed a single word. "I don't know." He placed a plate on the table with a piece of dark bread and some cooked roots. Then he moved away, not sitting himself. She approached slowly, sat and ate. The food was plain, but it was nourishing and prepared with care. That too confused her. She had braced herself for neglect, for indifference, perhaps even for cruelty. Instead she had been given space. That night she lay on the narrow bed with her eyes wide open. She listened to the wind whispering against the stone walls. She heard the soft, infrequent movements of Caleb in the other room. There was nothing more. No attempts. No further words. She clutched the rough blanket to her chest, remembering her father's words, a piece of currency. And here she was in a stone cottage with a man who saw her but did not consume her, who noticed her but did not judge her. Sometime before dawn she was woken by the sound of rain, a gentle but persistent drumming on the slate roof. Eleanor rose and moved silently to the window. Outside, the faint glow of a lantern illuminated Caleb's phone. He was sitting on the small porch, simply watching the darkness as if in conversation with it. She stood there perfectly still, watching him from a distance. And in that moment something stirred inside her. It wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was something else, a new and unsettling feeling, as if for the first time in her life someone was treating her as an equal. Not a burden, not a shame, not a punishment. Just a presence. She returned to her bed, closed her eyes tight, and thought, if he does not hate me, then why does this hurt so much? Caleb's silence was a mirror, and in it she saw all of her own cracks. But there in the simple home of the bonded man, the first seed of a new story was planted. A story in which perhaps she was not just what they said she was. The silence of the deep night was thick, almost solid. A black velvet curtain had been drawn across the world. The distant chirping of crickets was punctuated only by the occasional crackle of dying embers in the hearth where the last traces of the evening fire clung to life. The small cottage slept, but inside Eleanor a storm was raging. Lying on the rough-spun mattress, her body was still but her mind was in turmoil. The thin sheet clung to her damp skin. Thoughts churned and collided. The pride she had been raised with warred with the desperate need to simply escape. She couldn't bear the contrast, the chasm between what she had been taught to feel and what she was now seeing. How could this man, this bonded servant, treat her with more dignity than her own flesh and blood? How could his quiet presence say so much and yet be so unbearable? It felt as if his very stillness saw through every wall she had ever built, exposing the frightened person she tried so desperately to hide. In the dead of night she rose. The cold earth of the floor met her bare feet like a shock of ice. She grabbed the simple woolen shawl that hung by the door and eased open the small side latch. It led to the back of the cottage. Outside, the wind was a living thing moaning through the trees. The darkness was absolute, an ancient, primal force. The trees whispered their restless secrets. The ground, still damp from the earlier rain, squelched beneath her feet. But she didn't look back. At first she walked, then her pace quickened to a frantic run. Her hands trembled, the shawl slipped from her shoulders. The chill of the night air crept through the weave of her dress, but she kept going like someone fleeing not just a place but their own skin. The muddy path gave way to an old hunter's trail, a twisting spine of earth where the moon struggled to pierce the thick canopy. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, it all formed a symphony of tension. But Eleanor didn't stop. She was running. Running from a kindness she couldn't comprehend. Running from the reflection of herself she saw in the quiet corners of that cottage. Running from the memory of aristocratic laughter and the unnerving calm in Caleb's eyes. It happened in an instant. The world tilted, a loose branch underfoot, a slip, a dry snap, and the fall. Her body tumbled down a steep, wet embankment. Mud clung to her dress, to her hair. The impact with the ground knocked the wind from her lungs. Her head struck a rock with a dull, sickening thud. The world spun on its axis. The sky seemed to flip upside down, and then there was only blackness. When her eyes fluttered open again, the world was a blur. The smell of damp earth, the coppery scent of dried blood and wood smoke. Her head throbbed, her arm ached with a deep, sharp pain, but she was wrapped in the warmth of a fur blanket. Someone was carrying her. Caleb. He held her securely, his face a mask of grim concentration, his breathing ragged. He was covered in sweat and mud and an expression that looked like raw relief. They had reached the cottage. He laid her down on the bed with impossible care. He gently cleaned the gash on her forehead with a damp cloth. The water was warm, the gesture impossibly gentle. Eleanor's soul trembled more than her body. "Why?" she whispered, her voice as fragile as a dry leaf in the wind. Caleb looked at her then. His deep eyes were weary but full. "Because you were given to me," he answered, his voice low and steady. "And I do not discard what life provides with disrespect." She turned her face away, and a single tear traced a silent path down her cheek. He left the room, returning minutes later with a fresh cloth, a bowl of crushed herbs, and a warm, honeyed broth. He fed it to her in small, quiet spoonfuls with the kind of focused care one gives to something precious. In the days that followed, Eleanor remained weak. A fever came, followed by chills, but Caleb was a constant, silent presence. He changed the dressings, he brewed broths, he whispered words she didn't understand in an old, ancestral tongue. And with every gesture another of her walls crumbled. Children from the nearby village left wildflowers on the windowsill. An old man brought a fresh blanket. An unknown woman left a jar of pumpkin preserves by the door. Eleanor, even in her delirium, began to see, to truly perceive. The world outside her old life was harsh, yes, but it was also made of people who knew how to care. One morning when the fever had finally broken, she woke to find a small, carved object on the stool beside her bed. It was a sculpture whittled from a piece of dark wood. It was the figure of a woman with her eyes closed and her hands over her heart. And carved into the base in a simple, rustic script were the words, "A great vessel for a vast spirit." Eleanor wept. She wept because no one had ever said such a thing to her. She wept because she was realizing that it wasn't the broth or the herbs that were healing her. It was the care. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of love. Time in the stone cottage flowed differently, as if the world's clocks had surrendered to the rhythm of the wine, the scent of burning wood, and the songs of the morning birds. Eleanor began to wake with the sun on her skin. A gentle warmth would steal through the narrow window, touching her cheek just before she opened her eyes. There was a newness to these awakenings. There were no gongs, no orders, no frantic maids. There was only the rich aroma of toasted corn coffee drifting from the kitchen and the soft sound of a fire being coaxed to life. Caleb was always already awake. Always. He moved without noise, without fanfare. But his presence filled the small house. He was like a sturdy tree, silent and vibrantly alive. He cooked with a quiet focus. He mended his own clothes. With neat, practical stitches he arranged herbs into small bundles that hung by the windows. And when he passed Eleanor in the small space, he would simply say, "Did you sleep well?" She would only nod. She still didn't know how to respond to such uncomplicated peace. For the first week of her recovery, Eleanor limited herself to observing. Her world had always been one of velvet drapes, cold salons, and servants with downcast eyes. Now she was discovering beauty in the packed earth floor, in the whistle of the kettle, in the delicate way Caleb washed his hands before touching the beans for their meal. The simplicity wasn't ugly. It was clean. It was real. As the days turned into a fortnight, Eleanor began to rise earlier. She started by making her own bed, sweeping the small porch, attempting to tie the bundles of herbs with clumsy, ineffective knots at first. Caleb watched her from a distance. He never corrected her, just offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You have a good touch with your hands," he said one day, catching her by surprise. She stopped what she was doing. No one had ever complimented her hands. They had always been called clumsy, too large. But there, in that simple sentence, was acknowledgement. One afternoon, Eleanor sat on the porch bench for hours, just watching the sky change color. It was a silent, breathtaking spectacle. The blue bled into gold, then lilac, then finally into a dark cloak pricked with the first stars. The village children were playing with wooden hoops in the distance. One of them, a little girl with short, messy braids, wandered closer. "Are you the strong man's wife?" she asked with innocent curiosity. Eleanor almost smiled. "I'm no one's wife," she thought. But the girl continued, "He looks at you like you are." Eleanor remained silent. The child's words echoed inside her like an ancient bell. The next day something shifted. Caleb was out in the garden planting roots when Eleanor approached him with a small basket. Inside was a mended shirt. She had spent the afternoon sewing by herself for the first time in years. "I fixed this," she said, holding it out. Caleb took the shirt. He examined the stitches, which were crooked but strong. "You made it with your heart," was all he said. She looked down, a flush of unfamiliar pride warming her cheeks. That night Caleb roasted cassava in the coals. Eleanor prepared a lemon balm tea with cinnamon bark. They sat near each other at the small table, not side by side but close enough to feel the warmth. They didn't touch, but they breathed in the same rhythm. The silence was no longer awkward, it was a companion. Later, when she went to her room, Eleanor found a single, small pressed flower tied with a red thread on her pillow. Beside it was a folded piece of parchment with his rustic script. It read, "Sometimes beauty does not need applause. It only needs space to grow." Eleanor pressed the note to her chest. She felt hot tears escape her eyes. For the first time she wasn't crying from pain. She was crying at being seen. Not as the oversized daughter of a lord, not as a piece of currency to be traded, but as a woman. A whole woman. From that day on, Eleanor began to sow seeds beside Caleb, to harvest roots, to wash clothes in the river, to laugh with the children. She learned to make soap from ash, to read the sky for rain, to recognize the scent of healing herbs. And slowly, gradually, she learned to recognize herself. Not as a shame, but as a woman who had a place in the world, even if that world had once told her she did not. The stone cottage, so small on the outside, had become a universe within her, and its simplicity had become her greatest wealth. It was late afternoon when the sky was stained a deep, burnished gold, as if the sun before departing wanted to share one last secret. Eleanor was gathering the dry laundry from the clothesline, folding each piece with a newfound, careful attention. The scent of herbal soap mingled with the smell of damp earth and the warm breeze that drifted in from the fields. Caleb was in the distance helping an old villager mend a collapsed fence. She was alone, but for the first time she did not feel loneliness. The cottage seemed to sing with her presence. As she went to place the linens in the small wooden chest that rested against the wall of her room, she noticed something was off. A gap. The back of the chest wasn't flush with the wall. Her curiosity piqued. She pushed it with some effort. The heavy piece of furniture scraped against the floor, revealing a dark, leather-bound box hidden in the cavity behind it. It was dusty and tied shut with a faded red cord. Eleanor hesitated. Her heart began to beat faster, as if it knew that this was not just a forgotten object but a fragment of something much larger, something she could not yet understand. She sat down on the woven rug, placed the box in her lap, and with trembling hands she untied the cord. Inside lay a miniature portrait. It was an old watercolor in soft, pastel tones, the face of a smiling young woman with dark, upswept hair and almond-shaped eyes. Her posture was serene, her lips delicate. Around her neck she wore a single carnelian stone on a silver chain, a necklace Eleanor recognized. She had seen it years ago around the neck of a cousin. She turned the portrait over. On the back, in a soft, almost faded script, were the words, "For my love, Caleb." The world stopped. The name was signed Lydia. Lydia Croft. Eleanor's own cousin, the daughter of her mother's sister. A woman who had vanished mysteriously years ago after a hushed-up scandal that had whispered its way through the corridors of the court. Eleanor clutched the portrait to her chest. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place with a painful clarity. The way Caleb had looked at her that first day, with surprise, with a flicker of memory. His quiet care, his almost sacred respect. He wasn't just seeing her an unknown woman. He was seeing the ghost of the woman he loved in her features. He had loved her cousin. That night she waited. She sat before the fire, the portrait placed on the mantelpiece beside her. When Caleb returned weary from his work, his shirt stained with dust, she didn't speak at first. She simply gestured to the painting. He froze. His body went rigid. His eyes took a long moment to blink. His hand hesitated before he reached for the small watercolor. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "Behind the chest." "It wasn't hidden from me, it was hidden from the world." Caleb sunk onto the stool opposite her. The fire danced between them, casting long, flickering shadows on their faces. "She loved me," he said finally, the words heavy with years of silence. "She chose me when no one else dared. I was a free man then, a royal messenger, but her father, your uncle," he found out. Eleanor listened, her own heart aching. Each word was both a knife and a caress. "He had me arrested on false charges. I was sold into bondage before the sun rose the next day. They told everyone she was sent abroad, that she died of a fever, but I never knew for certain." Caleb's eyes were shining now, not with anger but with a grief that was still raw. "And now you." Her own blood. With the same eyes, the same spirit. "When you arrived, I thought it was some kind of punishment, some cruel irony of fate. But then I began to understand. It was a new beginning." Eleanor could barely breathe. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to think I saw you as a shadow of the past. You are you, Eleanor. But it is impossible not to love the parts of you that remind me of what was torn from me." The words were plain, honest, without manipulation or pleading. Just the truth. Eleanor rose slowly. She moved towards him and looked deep into his eyes. "So you care for me with the memory of the woman you loved?" He nodded. "And with the hope of loving again if you would let me." She didn't answer with words. She simply sat on the floor beside his stool, leaned her head against his knee, and there, caught between memory and loss and the warmth that was beginning to grow from within, she understood. Some women are not loved first for their beauty. Some are loved for their history. And Eleanor for the first time felt that her own history was only just beginning. That night the sky seemed starless, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath, listening to the questions Eleanor's heart still couldn't speak. She paced the small room, her bare feet silent on the cool, rough-hewn floorboards. The portrait of Lydia remained on the mantel, illuminated only by the flickering light of a single candle. The flame swayed and danced as if it felt the same doubt that was burning inside her. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't make sense of it. Caleb had loved. She knew that now. But it was the fact that he had loved before, and that his love had been for her own blood, that pierced her. It was impossible not to feel like a replacement, an echo, a ghost in her own story. She felt torn in two. One part of her wanted to run, to disappear into the night and scream at the injustice of it all. The other part wanted to stay, to feel, to touch, to understand. That's when he appeared in the doorway. He was still in his work shirt, unlaced at the neck, his skin still damp from the evening air, his eyes watchful. "May I come in?" he asked. She didn't answer, but she didn't say no. Caleb entered slowly and sat on the wooden stool on the far side of the room. He made no move to get closer, no attempt to crowd her. He just took a deep breath. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that screams everything the mouth cannot say. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Do you see me, or do you see what you lost?" Caleb lowered his eyes for a long moment. Then he raised his head, his gaze firm. "I saw what I had lost when you first arrived," he said, his voice steady. "But then I began to see what I might gain if I was brave enough to feel again." She frowned. "And are you?" He answered without a flicker of hesitation. "Not yet. Because I cannot truly feel what you do not permit me to offer." The words were spoken with a quiet finality, no complaint in them, only a truth that hung in the air between them. Eleanor took a small step closer, sinking to the floor near the hearth. They remained there, two silent figures in the dim light. The fire crackled, casting their dancing shadows on the cottage walls. Then she asked softly, "Why did you never try to touch me? Not when I had the fever, not when you slept so close on the porch." "Why?" Caleb leaned forward slightly. His strong, calloused hands clasped together over his knees. "Because love, Lady Eleanor, is not hunger. It is time. It is space. It is listening." She looked at him then, as if hearing a language long forgotten. "But I am yours. I was given to you as property." Caleb closed his eyes as if feeling a great weight press down on his chest. "You are not a possession. You are a person. And I do not touch what is not freely given." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, because in that moment she understood that Caleb, the bonded man, the one marked as a slave, was freer than she had ever been. He loved by choice, with boundaries, with dignity. She, who had always been seen as an object, a punishment, an excess, was now being seen as a woman. Whole, complete, respected. Her eyes filled with tears. "And what if I give?" she whispered. Caleb moved closer, then stopping just inches from her. "Only if it is your choice. Not from pity, not from gratitude, not for the past. But for the present." She raised a trembling hand and touched his face. The skin was warm, the stubble of his beard rough against her palm. She smelled the scent of earth and wood and a man who lived by his own honor. "I am afraid," she said, her voice catching. He offered a small, sad smile. "So am I." And then he brought his forehead to rest against hers. Not a kiss. Not a rush. Just skin against skin. Breath with breath. And in that moment everything that had been doubt became a seed. They were not yet lovers, they were not yet a promise, but they were a possibility. And for Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime being denied even the possibility of being chosen, that was the greatest form of love she had ever known. The next day the great iron gates of Blackwood Manor groaned open with a long, deep sound, as if the ancient structure itself felt the weight of the person about to enter. Eleanor walked with a steady stride up the long, gravel drive. She wore a simple dress she had sewn with her own hands. It was plain, yes, but it was full of symbolism. Embroidered along the hem were the leaves of the resilient hawthorn and the quiet violet. Her hair was braided with the same crimson ribbon which moved in the breeze like a declaration that she had returned, but she was not the same. Caleb walked a few paces behind her. His posture was erect, his presence silent, but his eyes said everything. Vigilance, memory, and a contained love. The news of Eleanor's return swept through the corridors like wildfire. Maids scurried, advisors whispered. Her two sisters Mary and Beatrice watched her approach from an upper window, their mouths agape. In the main hall, as he always was, Lord Ashworth waited. He sat in his high-backed chair dressed in somber grey. His face was a mask of controlled fury. Beside him stood a man with strikingly similar features, Baron Croft, his brother-in-law. Lydia's father. The alliance of lies was reassembled. Eleanor did not hesitate. "I have come to find what was buried by fear," she announced, her voice ringing out like a clear bell. The Lord arched an eyebrow. "Buried? What is the meaning of this spectacle?" From a leather satchel she produced the portrait of Lydia. She held it up for all to see. The light from the grand chandelier made the old, yellowed paper gleam. "This is Lydia. Your brother's daughter. My cousin. The woman who loved this man, and was ruthlessly silenced." Baron Croft shot to his feet, his face flushing a dangerous red. "This is absurd. An old and worthless story." But Eleanor was not intimidated. A love is never worthless. Her child was not worthless. The child she was carrying in her womb when you had her taken away. The son or daughter whose existence you erased so you could imprison an honorable man as punishment for his courage and for the truth. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Eleanor turned to her father. "And you, father? You knew all of it. You helped orchestrate his sale. You were complicit. When Lydia was dragged away, you signed the papers, you sealed the lies. And years later you gave me to him as a punishment. You repeated the same crime with the same cowardice." Her father rose slowly from his chair. "I did what was necessary. He was not worthy of an Ashworth woman. Just as you were never worthy of my name." The words cut through the room like a blade, but Eleanor did not flinch. "Nobility is not in a name, father. It is in one's actions. And in this palace where so many women have been broken by force, I am the one who has chosen to break the silence." Mary, her sister, turned her face away. The butler pressed his lips into a thin line. Even the advisers seemed to shrink from the truth that had been laid bare. Eleanor walked to the center of the hall, her footsteps echoing on the cold marble. "I was given away like an object, but I found more honor in a cottage of mud and silence than I ever knew here. I was scorned for my body and loved for my soul by a man you tried and failed to erase." Caleb remained silent, but his eyes glistened with unshed tears. For the first time he was being defended, acknowledged in the open. Baron Croft spoke again. "And what do you want now, girl? An apology?" She fixed him with a stare. "I don't want your apology. I want you to know that we know what you did. I want this palace to never feel clean again so long as you pretend the story of Lydia and Caleb is nothing but a shadow." Lord Ashworth ground his teeth. "You have no voice here." Eleanor took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and then she said something that sealed her fate. "You are right. I do not." She paused, and with a voice filled with a painful peace, she declared, "I am not an Ashworth. And thank God I no longer need to be." The statement landed like a thunderclap. She held out her hand to Caleb. He took it, his grip firm and gentle, and together they turned and walked out of the great hall. Outside, the sky was clearing. The moon was beginning its slow ascent, a silent witness to a woman who had returned to the site of her deepest wounds, not to beg for a place but to prove that she had survived without one. Eleanor no longer needed their acceptance. She had chosen who she was. And that woman was finally free. The morning was born with a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of emptiness but of anticipation. A pregnant silence waiting to be filled with something sacred. Eleanor woke with her heart racing. The wind through the open window carried the scent of wildflowers from the meadows and the distant, tinny sound of the bell from the small chapel in the next village. Today was the day. The day they would look for Lydia's child. The revelation had come from an old, trembling housekeeper who had approached her 2 days after the confrontation in the palace. With eyes full of guilt she had confessed. The girl did not die. She was given to a priory. A secret refuge for the inconvenient daughters of the court. It is beyond the mountains near the old mill. Eleanor had squeezed the old woman's hand not with anger but with a sense of urgent promise. Now mounted on a small, sturdy horse beside Caleb, she followed the narrow tracks that wound through sleeping forests and across shallow streams. The path was long and twisting, but their purpose was straight and clear. The priory was a humble place, low stone walls, a small orchard, and a simple wooden chapel weathered by time. Girls in plain colorless dresses ran in the packed earth courtyard, their eyes full of a life that their surroundings tried to mute. A woman with a pale, stern face, the Mother Superior, received them with a searching gaze. The girl Willow, she has always known she was different. That she was not born to this silence, she said, leading them down a corridor that smelled of fresh bread and dried lavender. Eleanor stopped before a plain wooden door. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed to reverberate in the stone walls. The door opened slowly. There, sitting on a rug, was a young girl with long, unbound brown hair reading an old book. Her eyes were Lydia's, but her nose, her chin, the set of her joyed scream of a face Eleanor recognized from her own mirror. It was blood. It was root. Willow, Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. The girl looked up. It was true. Eleanor sunk to her knees, tears streaming down her face. You do not know me, but I have known of you since before you were born. Caleb entered right behind her. His expression transformed as he saw the girl. A mixture of wonder, tenderness, and awe, like a man finding a lost piece of his own soul. The Mother Superior watched in silence. Are you my mother? Willow asked, her voice small. Eleanor smiled through her tears, her hands pressed to her chest. No, my flower. I am your cousin. But perhaps I can be your mother too if you'll have me. Willow looked from Eleanor to Caleb. Caleb took a step forward and knelt down. With shining eyes he took one of the girl's small hands in his. And I, he said softly, am the man who loved your mother with his whole soul and who was kept from ever knowing you. Willow looked between the two of them. After a long moment of silence, a shy smile bloomed on her face like the first crocus of spring. So I can have a family now. Eleanor wept without trying to hide it. You never stopped having one. On the journey back, Willow rode the small horse guided by Eleanor. Caleb walked steadily beside them. The sun bathed them in a golden light and the road seemed less harsh. Back at the stone cottage, Willow observed everything with curious eyes. She touched the wooden bench, the dried flowers, Caleb's books, Eleanor's weaving. This is home, she asked. Yes, Eleanor replied, stroking her hair. More now than ever. That night the three of them ate dinner together. Cooked roots, cornbread and sweet tea. Willow laughed at simple things. She told them stories she had read in the Priory's books. Caleb smiled quietly, his eyes fixed on her like a man trying to memorize every gesture. Before she went to sleep, Eleanor told the girl the story of her mother Lydia, not with bitterness but with love. Willow fell asleep with her head in Eleanor's lap, and Caleb sat beside them, stroking her hair with a gentleness that showed he now understood that everything had a reason. That night Eleanor looked at the sky from her window and thought, love is not just finding. It is rebuilding. And for the first time in her life she felt completely and utterly whole. The stone cottage, once a place of silence and solitude, now breathed with life. The wooden door had been painted a soft blue. In the yard wildflowers bloomed in planters made from hollowed-out gourds. The scent of herbal soap brewed in a large iron pot mingled with the country air. Children laughed and ran between stalks of corn. Women sang old songs as they sewed together in the sun. What was once Caleb's cottage was now known by all as Hearthstone Refuge, and it was Eleanor who kept its heart beating. She walked among them in a dress of rough linen, her hair held back, with a scarf embroidered by willow, her bare feet firm on the earth like the roots of a tree. Her eyes no longer searched for approval, they now offered it. After the reunion with Willow, Eleanor decided to transform the cottage into more than just a home. She decided to make it a home for new beginnings. Young women who had been cast out by the court for becoming pregnant without permission. Girls orphaned by the border wars. Forgotten daughters, widows with no prospects. For them, Eleanor offered sanctuary, teaching and respect. Each found a purpose. Willow gathered herbs. Others learned to sew, to spin wool, to read and to write. The garden grew with each passing week. The clay oven built by Caleb with the help of the older women breathed out the scent of fresh bread each morning. Eleanor taught with a soft firmness, with the calm voice of someone who had learned that love needs deep roots to grow strong. She didn't just mend cloth, she mended fractured stories. One afternoon a young woman named Leah, thin and with eyes that held far more pain than her years, approached her shyly. Lady Eleanor, can I be someone too? Eleanor took the girl's hand in hers. Her own hands, strong and broad, now held a power that had no violence in it. You already are someone, Leah. You just need to remember it. Leah cried because no one had ever spoken to her that way. Caleb observed it all from nearby, not as a leader or a savior but as a foundation. He did the work no one saw. He repaired the roof, he planted trees, he carved wooden toys for Willow and the younger children. And every night he sat with Eleanor on the porch in a silence that was now full of shared meaning. Willow grew like the land around her, fertile, vibrant, strong. She learned from the books Eleanor had brought from the Priory. She sang while she washed the linens. She learned words in 3 different dialects. She called Caleb grandfather of my heart, and she called Eleanor mother. The villagers who had once gossiped now stopped on the road to offer greetings. Some asked for advice, others donated seeds, clay or bread. And they all said the same thing, you have done for us here what the nobles in their manners never did. Eleanor would smile without pride because she now knew her nobility wasn't in her blood but in what flowed from her hands. In the center of the main house she had a wooden mural built. On it hung hand-painted portraits of every woman who passed through the refuge. Above them in letters carved by Caleb were the words, "Where there was no place for us we made our own ground." At night under the soft glow of lanterns Eleanor would sit with Willow and tell her stories. Not fairy tales but real tales of pain, of survival, of courage. And the girl would listen with wide shining eyes and ask, "Mother, why are the cruel people so afraid of the good ones?" Eleanor would stroke her hair and answer, "Because the good ones show them everything they have denied in themselves." That night as she closed her eyes in a hammock woven by the woman's hands, Eleanor felt something new. It wasn't pride. It was belonging. She hadn't just been saved. Now she was the one who saved. And in the heart of every woman sleeping there was the quiet certainty that someone finally had seen them. That someone finally had believed in them. And that someone had a name. Eleanor. The woman who was given as a punishment and who became the foundation for a new world. Time had passed not in a hurry but with wisdom. Eleanor's dark hair was now threaded with silver that shone like stardust in the sun. Her hands lined with the map of her work were still strong, but they now knew when to rest. Her skin carried the soft marks of a life fully lived, and her eyes were as intense as ever, only now they carried no weight. It was twilight at Hearthstone Refuge. The sky was painted in strokes of rose and gold with clouds scattered like whales dancing in the wind. The tall trees swayed their canopies as if offering a blessing over the fertile ground where so many stories had been planted. The laughter of women filled the air, mingling with the whisper of dry leaves and the first chirp of the evening crickets. Eleanor sat in her wooden chair, its seat woven from straw. Beside her, Willow, now a young woman herself, was reading aloud to a group of girls seated on rugs on the packed earth. The book was old, its cover thick, and its pages worn, but the words inside were alive. She was given as a punishment, offered as a sentence, but loved like a queen. Willow read, her voice clear and sweet. And in the mud where others saw only dirt, she made flowers bloom. The girls sighed with rapt attention. Some leaned their heads on their friends' shoulders. Others closed their eyes as if to hold the story inside their chests. Willow closed the book gently, smiling at her small audience. "And do you know what her name was?" The girls answered in a soft chorus. "Lady Eleanor." Eleanor let out a quiet laugh. The sound of it was like an old tapestry stitched with threads of new joy. She lowered her eyes for a moment in humility, as if still surprised by the path her life had taken. Caleb appeared in the doorway of the cottage. Older but still formidable, his shoulders broad, his dark eyes as alive as they were in his youth. He carried a ball of fresh-picked berries. Willow ran to him, gave him a hug, and they went inside together to prepare the evening meal. Eleanor was left alone for a moment, watching the last of the sunset. There on that porch she remembered it all. The drawing room where she was humiliated, the carriage that abandoned her, the silence of Caleb, the fall, the healing, the truth. The lost girl. The woman who chose to be herself. And then she smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of peace. Of a quiet internal conquest. Eleanor hadn't won a war against the world. She had won a war against herself. And that was more than enough. That same night, under a sky scattered with stars, Willow approached her holding a single candle. "They have asked me to choose a name for the new garden," she said. May I call it Eleanor's garden? She replied with eyes full of tears. Only if you promise to love the plants every day. Willow nodded. Then in a gesture that was now part of both their souls, she took the older woman's hand in hers and whispered, "You chose me, and because of that I am free." Eleanor held her close, a deep, knowing embrace, the embrace of someone who knows that the strongest seeds are the ones that sprout in the mud after the rain. Before she went to sleep, Eleanor walked to the memory mural. She touched each portrait one by one, and in the center she placed a new frame. In it was the portrait of Lydia. "Now you are home too," she said softly. She returned to the porch, looked up at the sky, the moon shining in its wholeness, and there, alone with the wind and her history, she spoke the words that closed her own book. "I was given as a punishment, but I chose to stay. And in that I won." If this story touched your heart, please like, comment with where in the world you are listening from, and subscribe to the channel. Because there are many women like Eleanor who were given away but who deserved to be chosen. Yes,